Hi everybody, this is another video covering the Brexit aftermath. It's now transpiring that Theresa May is going to be a candidate against Boris Johnson for becoming Prime Minister of Britain. And it is ironic that, we are totally mirroring the United States with Hillary Clinton and Trump, and it's like, who's going to be leader of Britain? She's the equivalent of Hillary Clinton, and then, he's the equivalent of Trump. And I'm really, disturbed because I think my worst suspicions are confirmed because it's come out recently. He's now stating that he's going to still be bargaining for freedom of movement in Europe, and saying he still wants us to be part of the single market, so he's going to be trying to do trade deals. Basically what has happened, as I knew it would, is that Britain hopes to be able to have all the advantages of being in the European Union, but without having to pay anything in, really, and also without having to abide by their rules, laws and regulations. And people think that it's a minor issue because, children are legally termed minors in Britain, but it's a minor issue, child protection directives, but actually it's a very important issue when you've got central London authorities full of paedo-sadists. And so they were very concerned about the issue of EU child protection directives that would have seen every single one of them arrested and thoroughly investigated. And obviously they've got a little baby trafficking ring going on there. People are still saying that it's a fantasy, but I think anybody who thinks it's a fantasy then needs to go and inform the United Nations, who claim that thousands of babies and children are trafficked into London every year, and that hundreds of them are being ritually murdered in pseudo-religious ceremonies. So, the UN have obviously perhaps been taking some sort of hallucinogenic drugs maybe before they wrote their 2014 child protection report, and maybe the baby charities in Africa that have been, where the babies have been coming from, where they persuade pregnant women, single mothers, a lot of them have been raped, to hand their babies over. They're paid a small fee and the baby's handed over, and these charities have, a lot of them are now being closed down because they're found to be involved in baby trafficking, and babies are being sold abroad for whatever purposes. But anyway, as I say, that is just a minor issue that humanity as a species can ignore because, being human means battling every day to limit your compassion and to turn away from the truth, not to use your intelligence, and to go against any instincts you might have to protect children. Put those to one side, focus on the money, just focus on the money. But even when it comes to the working class people of Britain, the working people of Britain, okay, we're not even allowed to focus on the money, because the money was totally cast aside from the Brexit debate, really. It was right from the start suggested by all opposing parties, including the BBC, as being scaremongering, and we're now seeing exactly, the banks they did warn us that Brexit would cause chaos and a currency crash. Okay, but that's a minor issue, because actually the important issue was stopping immigration. But actually Boris Johnson is going to move to request that we still have freedom of movement. So immigration is very likely to decrease. So is very unlikely to decrease. So basically what's happened is that, as I say, Britain's left the EU. We've left all the benefits of the EU, but we're still going to have exactly the same problem that people voted leave for, which, you know, was it really a problem? Because, as I say, it was really just a massive exaggerated concerns, because most of the people that come into Britain as illegal immigrants don't even come from the EU, you know, they come from other countries, and as it says here, a lot of them return home, a large majority of them return home after a few months. And were they really, you know, robbing Britain of homes and jobs? Now, in my other videos I've explained that we are going to suffer now, and it was already predicted that house prices would fall, mortgages would go up, rents will go up, prices will go up. You know, high inflation, higher interest rates. I think it's very interesting that the banks had a £250 billion cash bailout, or cash support for the banks immediately after the Leave vote. So, you know, they've got £250 billion to pull out of their magic hat the moment the banks come under threat through the Leave vote. But they couldn't inject that into creating a more sustainable economy in Britain. And now, as I predicted, now the central bankers will attack to punish the British people for exiting the EU. The central bankers were always going to attack. They have been attacking us for decades. And it's been a heightened attack since 9/11. We know that. And the bankers were attacking the EU nations because of the deficits that every nation has, and that the whole of Europe has and Britain has. So there's no getting away from the deficit, there's no getting away from the central bankers. And a lot of people seem to forget the fact that the central bankers control the EU, the same as they control Britain, the same as they control America, the same as they control virtually every nation on earth. So it's not a question of the bankers will attack, it's a question that British people have now deprived themselves of the rights that EU laws and regulations exist to protect them for. Now they've gone, the bankers are free to do what they like. And if it means making people homeless, they will. If it means criminalising homelessness, that will be what happens. Now, under EU law, it would be impossible to criminalise homelessness. Because, you know, everybody's got a right to shelter, to a home. So how can they be a criminal? Because their right has not been upheld. But in America, homelessness is illegal, you know, is a crime. They take homeless people and they put them in a factory prison for 3 months. That is what happens in America. It wouldn't have been able to happen in Britain because of EU human rights and EU courts of justice. Now, I've got some homeless friends, and they have told me that they were unable to vote in this election because they have no fixed abode, and therefore they don't get a poll card. And, you know, so they didn't vote. A lot of homeless people didn't vote. And I think those are the people that have, you know, people are complaining about the money situation, which is going to be bad. And it is not because we're being punished by the banks because we voted to exit the EU. We were always going to be punished by the banks. We were being punished by the banks. Every nation was and is. But now we're more open to that attack. We're more open to that attack. You see. So I think it's a major concern that homeless people have largely not had a voice in this election, in this referendum, and nobody in authority has made any efforts to ensure that homeless people have a voice and have a vote. And so therefore, and yet those homeless people have the most to lose, because they could now end up being criminalised just for being homeless. And as I've said, the agenda is to take us back to Victorian Britain. And in Victorian Britain, it was vagrancy, it was a crime. If you were stopped in the street and you had less than a certain amount of money on you, you could be taken off the streets and incarcerated for vagrancy. And, you know, I think that law might still exist. I think it's one of those little laws that weren't repealed, you know, that have just stayed around. I mean, I don't know, maybe now it has been actually removed, who knows. But such a law is unacceptable within the EU. It's unacceptable. You know, you just would not accept that because somebody hasn't any money, that therefore they are a criminal and need to be incarcerated for the crime of vagrancy. And unfortunately, that is the kind of thing that British people have opened themselves up to when we hear people like Jacob Reeves-Mogg, who is Eton Oxford educated, very, very strongly speaking out on behalf of Brexit, in support of Brexit. And yet from the ground I'm being told that this battle is, you know, it's between a self-serving elite and the working people. But so why is he so keen? Why is an Eton Oxford educated man, you know, questioning, slamming the Bank of England, the governor of the Bank of England, for releasing very gloomy figures, a forecast in the event of us leaving the EU, in the event of Brexit being successful. He released very, very gloomy figures, and he held a tribunal specifically to slam him, saying actually it was illegal what you did, really, it was unethical, because you're influencing the public and you're supposed to be taking a back seat, but you're actively influencing the public by telling them that it's going to be really bad economically for Britain. And yeah, if we look back to the Scottish referendum, nobody complained then about the banks and all the Conservative MPs talking about how bad it was going to be economically for the Scottish people, and how it was highlighted how terrible it was going to be for the Scottish people if they voted to split from Britain. And people were scared, you know, that was scaremongering, because nobody could know really which way it was going to pan out. And that wasn't from the bankers, that was from the MPs. You know, you didn't have the Governor of the Bank of England coming forward telling Scotland it's going to be really bad if you split from Britain. But we did have the Governor of the Bank of England coming forward warning British people that it is going to be really bad if we split from the EU, because that is a massive impact. Now, we have every reason to lawfully suspect that the Scottish referendum was rigged, and we have we have video recorded evidence of it. And just one incident where there's somebody changing votes who sat at the counting table, you know, and actually there's a lot of evidence of that. That puts the whole thing out. You know, the whole referendum's in disrepute, because you've got people, if you've got one person, you've caught one person on camera, actually I think they've caught three. And then we did all see on Sky News the big pile of the no trolley with yes votes very clearly on top of it. And then later on they said, oh, we just put those piles on there. You know, they hadn't been counted yet. So, you know, but as I say, if you find just a couple of people on video record altering votes within a huge referendum like that, where you've got how many counters and different people involved, if you've got two on record as changing the votes, then you have to assume that there was a lot more than two changing the votes, and that they are acting on behalf of others as well. That, you know, they're not just sat alone thinking, well, I don't want to leave, or I don't want to stay, you see, or I want to stay part of Britain, so personally, because of my personal thing, I'm going to change the votes. But because you find more than one person doing that, then you have to suspect, lawfully you have to suspect. And these things, you know, although they've been dismissed as a very little thing, no, it's a very, very important thing, because you're talking about the lives of a whole nation of people, the Scottish people, whose future and their choice was altered. We lawfully believe that. We lawfully suspect it because of the evidence. Now, was the Scottish referendum rigged in order to prevent the Scottish people from becoming independent from Britain? Exactly because it was known to British government that this EU referendum was coming up, and were Scotland at that time an independent nation, as is Southern Ireland, and they voted to stay in the EU, we would be in a situation where Scotland remained part of the EU while Britain and Wales were out of it. And that could have been a massive benefit for Scotland, because how many British businesses would have been able to move to Scotland? You see, all the British businesses that are at risk now, and there are many, and we're talking about, and that's my concern, it's about British wealth, the holding of British people, not corporations, not investors, global investors, British people with their own businesses, who were independent people making their own money from their own businesses. And they are all most of them are going to collapse now. That is the truth of it. And a lot of other businesses are leaving British shores to move to Europe. Now, I think it's UK Column have done a thing here. Shocking list of asset stripping by the EU. And again, you know, they're accusing the EU of asset stripping Britain, because all these corporations are moving now, the big businesses are moving to Europe. So, but is that really asset stripping? No, because, you know, a business is going to follow the money, isn't it? And they're not going to stay in Britain if suddenly half our market has been cut out of the picture. It isn't a conspiracy. It's just what happens. It is just what happens. It is a conspiracy in the sense that this was orchestrated by people who knew full well what the results would be, as was forecast by the Bank of England. But as I say, you know, suddenly those British people being persuaded to vote against a self-serving elite were actually doing exactly what the self-serving elite wanted, because now British people will have no rights. And Britain was going to be compelled to become a fully fledged member of the EU, which means we would have had to take on board their human rights more seriously. Now, as I say, Britain is now divided. It's a divided nation, and it's further divided because now Scottish people want to stay in Europe. But how can they? So then there's going to be, because they're still part of Britain, they voted to stay in Britain, you see. So the EU is now kicking its feet about letting Scotland remain part of the EU. And that is what I mean about how serious it is when you have a rigged election, and it means the Scottish people have been robbed. And they were bombarded by the BBC and MPs for doing exactly what this man gave Mark Carney, you know, a savage attack, basically, because he released the figures. He expressed concerns about what would happen to Britain if, after Brexit, what would happen to our economy, you see. And he blasted him for that and said it was unethical for him to do that, and showed his bias. And yet, you know, it was all people like him, MPs, and the BBC's financiers, finance reporters, who were continually telling the Scottish people about how dreadful the economic impact would be on their economy. So, had the Scottish referendum not been rigged, which, as I say, we have lawful suspicions. Our suspicions are not without evidence, lawful evidence. Scotland now, where would the Scottish pound be? Where would the Scottish pound be? And this is how Scotland has been robbed. I believe Scotland has been robbed, and it is a conspiracy. It's a massive conspiracy, it's a major conspiracy, and it is a New World Order agenda, I believe. And, you know, I'm absolutely disgusted with David Icke that he supported this, because, and I just don't understand why he did it. You know, I mean, maybe he did it with the best intentions in heart, because he's so hyped up on his own rhetoric that he really does believe that Europe is the monster on this earth. A united Europe is a major risk to humanity. When he, you know, who does not know the strategy of divide and rule? And we know that Europe, yes, it is infected by corrupt individuals. As I say, every power on earth is. That's the situation we're in today. It is the battle between, you know, lawful people and criminals. That is the battle. And the criminals are everywhere. You know, Europe isn't unique in that respect. But the people on the ground, they were standing up against the banks. All of them. They're all standing up against the banks. They're all demonstrating. They're all saying that they want the debt, that the banks are illegal, and they want the criminals arrested. You know, they're all shouting for law, basically, because the bankers have got away with murder and grand theft. That's the fact of it. There's no getting away from that fact. Now, the EU Union has been put up as a kind of scapegoat for British people to vent their aggression and anger on, and as along with the immigrants, who are actually the least of our problems when it comes down to it, because as I say, even now the immigrants aren't going to be here, according to Brexit campaigners. We're going to have no more immigrants. So the British economy should have instantly boosted then, shouldn't it? Because apparently these immigrants were robbing us of tens of billions every year. But the tens of billions that they were robbing us of, as Boris Johnson told people, well, where are they? You know, where's going to be the benefit of them? Because actually, suddenly we haven't got tens of billions. The BBC now informs us that we're going to have a 44 billion deficit. And, you know, I think the Scottish people need to think about how it is that they are now going to be governed by him, okay, who got beaten in the mayor election by Sadiq Khan. Now, I've got nothing against Sadiq Khan. I've got absolutely no problems with having an Asian MP. In fact, I welcome it. We are a multicultural country, and we should have fair representation. All authorities should reflect that. But again, it's like, we know very well that the fact that he is now mayor, and then you've got exactly at a time, because this was in like May, and just at the time they were starting for the vote started talking about Brexit and telling people, yeah, the vote's going to be in June. You know, at that same period when they've raised, the whole media has raised and highlighted the issue of immigration and Britain no longer being British, the British people. And then suddenly, you know, just at that time, there's an Asian man made mayor. And it covertly feeds that undercurrent of, see what I mean? They're taking us over. It heightens that unreasonable, irrational argument. Because actually, Sadiq Khan is a British person. And it really shouldn't make any difference where he comes from. As long as if he's upholding good things, if he's upholding the law and rights and looking out for people, well, what difference does it make where, you know, what his ethnicity is? But the point that I want to make here is that if Boris Johnson could not even win the mayor election for London, what right has he got now to be made Prime Minister of Britain? How can he be made Prime Minister of Britain when even the people of London didn't want him to be their mayor? He couldn't even win. I mean, if he was Mayor of London at the time, then he that would have been a different story. But actually, he's lost the vote to be Mayor of London. Londoners have no confidence in him. So now he's going to be running the whole of Britain and Scotland. So the Scottish people who've been robbed of their referendum and scaremongered by people like him going on about, which they did. They all went to Scotland. Cameron and Osborne, or was it Ian Duncan Smith? I know a few of them went to Scotland and they specifically harped on and on and on about the economic impact. And yet, this man and lots of others, you know, and he got massive coverage, you know, on the BBC. You know, lays into David Cameron, lays into, oh, he's the hero of the day, and him. Okay. And they were having a go at anybody who spoke about the economic impact as scaremongering. And even the BBC covertly supported that as well, because they failed to interview the professionals, the experts. You know, they focused only on people like him, spokespeople, front people. They're not necessarily experts. You know, when you've got like the Treasury explaining that wages are going to fall and that working tax credit and benefits are going to be cut. When you've got those kind of issues, okay, immediately. And he was slamming people for warning the British public about that. But when it came to Scotland, they had no problem. None of the establishment had any problem harping on to the Scottish people about how terrible it was going to be for them economically if they left Britain. And independence got shoved out of the picture as like a triviality. The issue of independence and closing borders and all this kind of stuff, it all got, well, that was like xenophobic, racist, nationalistic stuff. You know, the harsh reality was the economy. But when it came to the EU referendum, the harsh reality of the economy, the economic impact, was brushed aside as scaremongering, and what was focused on more was the xenophobic nationalism and the issue of independence. And yes, the aristocracy of Britain would very much like independence and no longer being committed to EU laws and regulations and human rights. It means they can once again return to the colonies, the Commonwealth, as Nigel Farage has already stated that yes, we can now rely more heavily on the Commonwealth. They can return to those countries, exploit them without having to uphold human rights or any of the laws and regulations, and they will not be held accountable for their actions by EU courts. Now, there has been complaints that the within the press that the EU courts have been giving justice to British people. I'm just looking for the link. I don't know which one it is actually, but it's one of these links. And well, basically they're saying that, you know, they were worried, they were dismayed about the fact that EU courts were undermining Britain. Well, were harming Britain, basically. That was the suggestion. You know, Norway said it's going to be bad. You know, this was from Alex Jones' channel. Again, Alex Jones, go away. You are, again, all this idea that global elite resort to voter fraud to prevent Brexit. So they turned the issue around. We know very well that they've been committing fraud. So what they did was, and I noticed this right from the start, the Leave campaign was saying, beware, they might alter the votes. But we know that they were always wanted to leave Europe. And I knew it. And I wrote to the President of the EU last year and said, I'm very concerned about this coming referendum that David Cameron's suggested, because I think it's a foregone conclusion. I think Britain will be leaving the EU regardless of how Britain votes. And I cited the general election and the Scottish referendum as evidence. And I stated very clearly that David Cameron had announced his intention to abolish human rights, to scrap human rights. He'd already announced his intention to do that. They've already drawn up their alternative proposal of a Bill of Rights. Now, the only way that David Cameron could ever scrap human rights for British people is by leaving the EU. Unless the EU scrapped human rights, every person in Britain would still have had human rights regardless of David Cameron's Bill of Rights, because he could not scrap those human rights, because every country that is part of the EU has to agree to uphold human rights. So, you know, we know that David Cameron fraudulently, he took part in fraud, because he fraudulently claimed to the British people that he wanted to stay in the EU. And we know that is not true because of his action of creating the Bill of Rights and supporting the Bill of Rights. It is impossible to stand against human rights and say, I'm going to scrap human rights, and then, on the other hand, claim that you want to be part of the EU. So he did. This man lied to the people. He presented a fraudulent campaign because he presented it, something to be as it was not. And he did warn the British people about the economic impact, as did his co-conspirator, George Osborne. And as I say, both of them used their unpopularity to an advantage. And I am concerned to find that my nation is now split, and my friends are telling me that they're witnessing people fighting on buses and in pubs, and families having big arguments, big fallouts over this. And now Scotland, you know, even more wants to separate from Britain, and they want to stay in the EU. But the EU has stated that, you know, they want Britain to leave. You know, out is out, the saying. There are going to be no trade deals. They want us out quick. No new reform deal for UK after vote, Jean-Claude Juncker warns. Okay, and who is Jean-Claude? He's the European Commission President. He stated clearly, out is out. Europe's very angry with Britain because we have destroyed British people have been persuaded into breaking our own union. Because, like I say, the bureaucrats are always going to be up there until the people on the ground get power and voice enough to challenge them successfully. And that is what we were working towards doing. And that has been cut now, it's stopped. Because Britain's out, and now the nationalists of every other country, they're all going to use the same agendas of immigration, independence, blah, 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 to do exactly the same thing, and then there will be no united Europe. And it isn't the EU governments or the EU Parliament that is really the focus of attention here, because they were always corrupt and serving the bankers anyway, or they were beholden to the bankers, which it doesn't make any difference. Either way, they have to follow the bankers' rules. What the real attack was against was the union between the people. Between the people on the ground who were all campaigning against austerity. And as I say, Scotland has been robbed. Because if Scotland had been allowed to vote, as I believe Scotland voted for independence, I believe that because I've witnessed the evidence of the rigging and because of the campaign that he put forward, him and his cronies, scaremongering the Scottish people about how bad it would be for their economy. And yet, look what has happened. And had Scotland actually succeeded in becoming independent from Britain, and then this referendum had come through, Scotland could have stayed in the EU. And as I say, what have Scotland been robbed of? Because he knew that this referendum was coming up. This EU referendum. Even though they hadn't really thoroughly discussed it much with the British people. But it certainly wasn't discussed to any degree in the Scottish referendum. The Scottish people weren't asked to consider about, look, if you stay with Britain, you know Britain's going to vote about whether or not to leave the EU. And then you'd be forced to leave the EU. Oh, and by the way, you could end up with either Boris Johnson ruling you or Theresa May. You know, I know that Nicola Sturgeon is the head of the Scottish Parliament, but at the end of the day, the fact that they're part of Britain means that Scotland has to go along with the decisions made by Britain. So the referendum is for Britain as a whole, and Scotland's included in that. And that means Scotland has been is now under the dictates of what he wants, what he wanted to do, and what he wants. And I don't trust them. You know, I don't trust these Etonians, because they live in a very isolated reality, really. And even, you know, I'm not saying he's an evil man. Maybe he genuinely believes what he believes in his heart, but it's just that they're wrong. That's it. People can be right or wrong. It depends what thoughts they're thinking, what their experience, wisdom, you know, what truth, what is the actual reality that their thoughts and argument is based on. And it isn't about winning, it's just about getting down to what's right, because we need to live by what's right. If we don't live by what's right, we're going to suffer. And it's not just the guilty that are going to suffer, because when people do wrong things, it's the innocent people that suffer the most. And especially if the guilty people get away with crime upon crime upon crime. And at some point, the innocent people have to stick together. They need to get together and unite. And Europe is a united force of people who have free movement and freedom of speech and rights. But now it's going to be divided. Divide and rule. Divide and rule, you know. So how could David Icke fail to alert the British people of that strategy, the age-old strategy of divide and rule? You know, it is an age-old strategy. So I don't understand how he could how he could not recognise what was happening here. That our union, you know, the Bilderbergs are still going to get together, aren't they? They're all the union of people who meet at Bohemian Grove every year. They're all still going to get together. So, as I say, it's very, very serious. And, you know, we had alternative news media warning us about the European police and the European army they want to develop. And yet here we are now, left in Britain with no human rights, under a corporate police force. And they have, you know, they've put the legislation up to do that. Now that's a serious thing. You know, it is like saying to somebody, do you want to swap your home alarm for this pink button? You know, the pink button, but the pink button doesn't actually work. And so we have no protection. We have no protection from criminals in power, because that's who the corporate police they're gonna mostly be serving the interests of the powers, the authorities. And they won't need to be committed to any human rights. And that's, I just don't understand. I don't understand why people aren't really concerned about that. And especially when we've got, you know, the levels of child abuse that's going on. And again, you know, now everybody's asking for, you know, Jeremy Corbyn to leave. You know, and I checked this lady out, Zoe Williams, and she's saying, Jeremy Corbyn's made his point, it's time for Labour to move on. Well, what point did he make? You know, he was there to keep the people distracted for a bit, so they didn't all immediately go and, like, revolt, probably, give everybody a bit of hope, dangle a carrot on the stick, and then it's like, no, whip him away now. He wasn't very strong in support of the EU anyway, and so, and she's saying, well, let's get rid of Jeremy Corbyn now anyway. And you know, I checked her out, she's part of the Humanist Society, and again, you know, Oxford educated, which I'm not saying is anything against her, but I'm saying, does she really understand? Just because she's been to Oxford, does that mean that she really understands what is going on here? And, you know, Leave would have run the referendum regardless. Of course it was going to win regardless, because David Cameron wanted it to win. They needed it to win, because they cannot get their Bill of Rights implemented while we're in Europe. That's a fact. It's a fact, you know. It's a fact. It's like somebody buying a hammer, saying they want to smash a window with it. Specifically stating, I'm buying this hammer, I want to smash this window with it. And then a couple of years later they say, shall we have a vote about whether or not we want to smash that window? And the person who's bought the hammer saying, well, actually, I'm voting against smashing the window. The person that's bought the hammer saying they want to smash the window, and the person who's called for the vote then says, but I don't want to smash the window. I'm supporting the let's not smash the window side. That is what David Cameron has done. That is what he's done. Without a shadow of a doubt. That's what he's done. And as I say, it's fraud. It is fraud. It was a fraudulent campaign. And the Scottish people, today, the Scottish people should have been celebrating. There should have been champagne flowing. Because it would have been a massive benefit to Scotland to have still been part of the EU as an independent nation. And that's why their referendum was fixed. And this is treason, it's high treason, it's treason. And I urge the Scottish people, we have got to stand up against this, because this, what else can it be? It's war, really. It's a war. It's a war of information. It's fraud, theft, deception, and actually murder as well. I'm absolutely disgusted. I just cannot believe, really, that people have fallen for it. So, you know, my heart goes out to everybody and sending love to all.